Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I'm Jamie Machik, and I work with the Nicolet Federated Library System in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Welcome if you are just joining us. If you've had participated in a few sessions or been with us all day, thank you for putting up with me and my voice all day. No, we're very glad you're here. Our system, Nicolet, along with several other public library systems in Wisconsin, have put this together. So we're very excited to be able to do this. In your question box, if you have a second, tell us where you're from. You might be from Green Bay like I am, or you might be from Rib Lake, or you might be from outside of Wisconsin. We'd love to see who is all listening in today. The cheesy sweater contest is now done, unfortunately, so the winner will be announced at the next session at 4 p.m. But coming up, we have with us right now Sarah Houghton. I'm very excited to hear her presentation. Sarah's given several webinars for us, and Sarah is currently the director of the San Rafael Public Library in San Rafael, California. So, Sarah, whenever you are ready, go right ahead.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for having me here today to talk about digital content and how that merges with our ethics as librarians and library workers. And I'm going to start off a presentation the opposite way of what you're supposed to do in any situation, which is to insult the entire audience. So I'm going to answer my own question. Are we hypocrites? Yes, we are hypocrites. The bulk of us are doing things with our digital content that I think directly violate our ethics as librarians, things that we never would have done with physical content, with programming, with our physical spaces. And we're doing it for a number of reasons. I think we could say fear, we could say a worry that will become obsolete or irrelevant. But really I think it goes back to, are we still following our core beliefs, or have things in the world changed so much that we need to reevaluate our core beliefs and set up a new set of values and ethics that work for us today? And so that's something to think about as we go through the presentation. So as I'm talking, feel free to argue with me. I like that. Feel free to type questions that you have into the chat. I'll address them as we go. And anything that I don't get to by the end, we'll address at the end. So let's go ahead and start. One of the things I think that we all know is that it's our job, it's what we get paid to do, to represent our users' interests. And with digital content, that means negotiating with vendors. It means researching products, finding out what the best case scenarios are for certain products, what the likely development in the future is going to be, keeping an eye on the landscape of all options, not just the big popular ones, and making sure that our individual communities and their needs and their wants are being represented in the choices that we make. I just want to reiterate the part about our communities, because not every community is the same. You could plop a generic Anytown public library with kind of a generic set of services in any town, and it will get used. But we all have our unique elements of our community, whether that's a particular interest or a particular economic challenge that's fairly widely spread, or linguistics, or digital divide issues, connectivity issues. We all have unique things going on, and I think it's essential that we not forget that in anything that we do, that each of our communities is going to be just a little bit different, and what works for a library in Kansas might not work for a library in Vermont for whatever reason, or what works for a library 2 towns over from me won't necessarily work for our library here. So it is okay to be different, but you always have to represent your users' interests. And that really does include reading all of your contracts. So, in the days of buying printed stuff, there really wasn't a whole lot of legalese to be aware of other than copyright law. Okay, we know what copyright law is. People can't Xerox the entire Oxford English Dictionary. That's bad. All right, clear enough. But now, with all of the contracts that we have to sign for digital content access, whether it's a yearly subscription service or an outright purchase of a piece of digital content, the terms of those contracts are different from company to company, often include legalese that we're not trained to understand. And so calling on the help of your city or county attorney, or maybe a volunteer for the library who happens to be a lawyer, I think those are all good things to do. You want to make sure you understand what you're agreeing to and what you're signing before you sign it. And we've seen a lot of examples over the last couple of years of digital content providers inserting somewhat mushy languaged clauses into their contracts that the libraries signed either without reading or without fully understanding the import of certain clauses, and then getting angry because they find out they didn't have full access to what they thought they had, or they thought they could cancel their contract but couldn't. So in the interests of representing your users' interests, make sure you read and understand those contracts. And I know it's not fun, but seriously, read the contracts before you sign them. I know of a library that said, oh yeah, we read all of our contracts. After our director signs them, we all get copies of them and we read them. And it's just like, no, you read them before you sign them, because after you sign them, you've already signed away your kingdom, and you've agreed to whatever terms and conditions they placed in there. And one of the things that's really important to recognize is that whatever you sign in your contract overrides any existing digital content or copyright law in existence. And so a company can place more restrictive terms of access on content than the law itself provides for. So when you sign those contracts without reading them, you're putting yourself, your users, the future preservation of that information digitally, your fiscal stability, you're putting all sorts of things at risk. And I think that's a big problem ethically for us, in that because we're not used to having to understand this stuff, we just ignore it. And I think that has led us down a very dangerous path. Another thing that I think we are very responsible for is being loud and vocal advocates to different groups that are involved with how digital content works, both at the library level and at the consumer level. So advocating to publishers individually and in their associations and groups, authors, to the vendors, the third-party vendors that we do business with that act almost as brokerages between us and the publishers and authors. Advocating to technologists who are developing the programming, the hardware, the software that makes all of this digital content accessible to our users. And then lastly, making sure we're advocating to government, be it local government, state, or federal government, to ensure that the laws that are being passed are not negatively affecting our users' rights to access information. And there have been a lot of laws lately that do just that, and much of the vocal outcry and uprising has come from groups that include librarians, because we see the future of information being locked down, inaccessible in future years as technologies change and as companies go out of business. And we want to make sure that stays accessible. So as much as we, I think, as a profession are not necessarily the most aggressive people or the most outspoken people necessarily on these issues, it's our job to do that. It's our job to be vocal advocates for our users on these issues. So there are a lot of library and librarian ethics out there, and we could look at probably a couple of dozen different lists and documents and manifestos. The problem is, by and large, the care meter for us on these issues is very, very low. Talking about library ethics with colleagues, I am often shocked to find out that they have no idea that there are these values and ethics statements out there, or if they're aware, they haven't read them since library school 15 or 20 years ago. And I would encourage all of you to actually go back and look at some of these documents, because they do have some pretty clear language that reminds us of what our responsibilities are. But also, I've often found that these documents contain language that can assist me in advocating for change on a local level, and to say we need to change this certain policy in order to stay in touch and in spirit with the American Library Association. So there are reasons to use this, and so I'm going to suggest that we look at, as American library people for the most part, I'm guessing, on today's webinar, 3 different documents. The American Library Association's Library Bill of Rights, which is a Bill of Rights for our users, what they can and should expect from their libraries. The ALA's Code of Ethics, which is more for us as library workers and what our responsibilities are. And then Ranganathan's 5 Laws of Library Science, which are always fun and pretty much relevant to anything that you're doing in your library. So all of these came out in the 30s, and it's amazing to me that all of these statements, some of which have been slightly revised since then, came out during this time period. Now, why the 1930s? I don't know, and trying to trace this back and to figure out the historical reasons why all of these ethical statements were coming out at the same time, it's not really clear to me why it all happened in the 30s, but it did, and it's amazing that all of this is still relevant today. So let's start with the ALA Library Bill of Rights. I think that's a good starting point because it says what our users need, and as we know, it's all about the users. So one of the statements in the Bill of Rights is that books and other library resources should be provided for the interest, information, and enlightenment of all people of the community the library serves. Materials shouldn't be excluded because of origin, background, or views of those contributing to their creation. So basically, we need to provide stuff for everybody in our community that works for them, and we shouldn't be excluding stuff for a number of reasons, that we should be as inclusive as possible. And so some of the things that have come up with digital content is that we're necessarily acting as gatekeepers with digital content selection, even more so now than we did with physical content, for 2 primary reasons. One, so very little content that we have access to physically is also available to us digitally, at least legally. And I won't get into the illegally what you can do, but you can. There's stuff you can do to make this stuff accessible to your users, but not legally, not in keeping with the terms of service of companies. And so we already have a much smaller subset of information accessible to people digitally simply because of the way that publishers and recording companies and movie studios have chosen to not make their content available to libraries and have limited their sales to the consumer market. So that's one definite problem. The other problem that we're seeing most markedly with ebooks is the severe price rises and the cost per use changes that we're seeing in licensing digital content as opposed to physical content. As many of the companies raise their prices or change the terms of access on the content they do license to us, we're able to select far fewer titles with the same amount of money that we could select in print. And so we're offering less stuff that is going to be of interest to our entire community. And this is completely anecdotal, and I have no data, research, or study to back this up, only conversations I've had with dozens of librarians across the country. What they're saying they're doing is they've stopped buying or licensing digital content in the quote-unquote niche areas. So if they have a relatively small Spanish-speaking population, let's say 10%, they've just stopped buying stuff in Spanish digitally because they don't have enough money to go around, and 10% of the population isn't enough to warrant spending any money on that. Or they've stopped buying stuff for middle schoolers, or they've stopped buying science fiction, or you name it. So it's a little bit scary that because our funding is necessarily limited and the prices keep going up, there's less and less we can make available. So to me, that's a big ethical dilemma. We also state that libraries should provide, this is also from the ALA Bill of Rights for Users, that libraries should provide material and information presenting all points of view on current and historical issues, and that materials shouldn't be prescribed or removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval. Alrighty, well, we have a problem. So we've already seen this happening over the last few years, We've seen books removed from people's e-readers, from people's electronic libraries that they have licensed or purchased, and this includes things that libraries had licensed for their e-readers if they were circulating them. Apple had taken a whole bunch of stuff out. They got rid of a graphic novel version of James Joyce's Ulysses because it had nudity. Alrighty. They got rid of Moby Dick because it was about a sperm whale, and the word sperm triggered the naughty word filter that Apple uses, once again proving that naughty word filters don't work very well. And that book was taken out, and the list goes on and on. And so Apple has really had a history of pulling titles pretty randomly and pretty stupidly with very poor judgment, and this is stuff that people had already chosen to license. So this is stuff being removed from collections without the individual or the library having any say whatsoever in it happening. The biggest irony was when Amazon erased in 1984 from Kindle devices, which is hilarious because it's 1984, and that went over like gangbusters and got a lot of press. So the fact that that stuff can be removed without us having any say is distressing, and definitely something we need to keep an eye on. Another element of the Bill of Rights is that libraries should challenge censorship in the fulfillment of their responsibility to provide information and enlightenment. So all of that stuff, all of that pulling books out, or we're not going to release this as a digital book on this device because we think it's naughty or we think it's offensive to whatever group, that's stuff that we need to challenge. And there are a lot of groups that we can work with. Libraries have fought censorship for a very, very, very long time and have stood up and said information should be out in the public eye. Information needs to be accessible, and I don't think that that has changed. And yet with digital content, it's so much easier to censor data. Just yesterday, in fact, I was trying to comment on one of my own Facebook posts, and it wouldn't let me post what I was writing because it somehow thought what I was posting was pornographic or evil or something. It didn't have any links in it, so it wasn't a link problem. There were no words in there that I could identify that were triggering its filter, but I got the little message that your message has been deemed unsuitable, blah, blah, blah. That's Facebook. That's a little scary that even that can happen. But when we're seeing digital content being removed from devices and not allowed out there, in the first place, not being published digitally because companies decide that they don't want to make it available, that's scary. It also states, kind of as a follow-up to that libraries should really cooperate with people and groups who are concerned with this, with resisting abridgment of free expression and free access to ideas. And so there are a lot of groups for us to work with, groups that we can collaborate with, that we can call upon for advice or assistance, and that we can work with. So the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the ACLU are probably the two most active and well-known organizations. Creative Commons, there's a lot of groups for us to work with. And if you're not aware of Peacefire, the logo that's in the upper right-hand corner, I would encourage you to be aware of it and its existence and what it can do. This is a site and a tool that's basically dedicated to helping people work around filters, internet filters. And whether you have filters in your library or not, that's a whole other discussion. But there are easy ways around them. And if people are not able to access totally legitimate, research-oriented information, and they need to, and you want to help them, the Peacefire site is one place to go to for advice on how to do that and the tools with which to do that. So let's go on to our second document of ethics, the American Library Association's Code of Ethics. This is more about what we're supposed to do and what's important about our role as librarians and library workers in our communities. So it's pretty clear up front. It says ethical dilemmas occur when values are in conflict. Thank you for stating the obvious. That is absolutely true. So the whole purpose of this Code of Ethics is to state the values to which we're committed as a profession and embodies the ethical responsibilities of the profession in this changing information environment. And so to me, the acknowledgement that things are changing, and yet we still have these ethical responsibilities that we need to hold fast to are really important. And our biggest ethic, I think, if you read through everything, is freedom. Freedom of access, freedom of expression, freedom of collaboration, freedom to do what you need to do to get your life to the place you want it to be. And there's a lot of danger with the paths that I see digital content taking. And I'm not just talking about ebooks, but movies and music, pretty much any digital content. There are so many potential places where that freedom could be blocked. There could be a barrier to that, whether it's at the device level, the software level, the operating system level, the network connection level, so the internet service provider could have some kind of a filter in place. They're saying you can't have access to this, or you can't download books from this site, or your traffic's going to be slower if you're downloading from Apple instead of Netflix, or whatever. There's a lot of danger here for freedom of information access to be impinged upon. And as I stated earlier, a lot of legislation has gone through or tried to go through in recent years to make it legal for companies to kind of self-selectively do what they want and to restrict access to content or lock down content with no legal repercussions. So another part of our code of ethics is that, this is long, sorry, we significantly influence or control the selection, organization, preservation, and dissemination of information. And that's really important. We do. We have a significant influence over this stuff. And in a political system grounded in an informed citizenry, we are members of a profession explicitly committed to intellectual freedom and the freedom of access to information. We, as librarians and library workers, have a special obligation to ensure the free flow of information and ideas to present and future generations. And this last part really triggers something in me, in that we're not only preserving and protecting access to information today, but we need to be thinking about, some years down the road. And the biggest impediment in my mind for that is digital rights management. And the technology that's used to, depending on how you decide to phrase it, either protect content or lock down content or restrict access to content, that technology is technology to which we do not have a key. We do not have access. That technology is created by a company. That company sublicenses its technology out to other companies, and those companies will give us the key as long as we keep giving them money. And it frightens me to think that all of the millions and millions of dollars that libraries are pouring into digital content every year could be going down the drain. That all of this content that is locked down with digital rights management may not be accessible to us in 5 years, in 10 years, much less 100 years. As the technology changes, as companies go out of business, as libraries' funding priorities change and we're no longer able to keep up this yearly subscription fee to get access to the 30 years worth of content we already bought, that frightens me. That makes me very, very nervous, because we are preservers of the cultural record. Our job, no matter what type of library you work for, is to make sure that people have access to information not only from the present but from the past. And I'm really concerned that by the time I'm ready to retire, some of the stuff that's coming out now won't be accessible. And I'm not trying to be melodramatic. I sincerely have that fear because of digital rights management. That's a really big thing for me, because I see it as the biggest threat to the freedom of information access that the world is facing, not just in libraries, but we're uniquely positioned to fight against it, and I think we need to do more of that. So here's another thing from our Code of Ethics. We provide the highest level of service, of course we do, because we're awesome, to all library users through appropriate and usefully organized resources, equitable service policies, equitable access, and accurate, unbiased, and courteous responses to all requests. Basically, we're nice to everybody and we try to give everybody equal access to everything. That would be the Sarah way of saying that, which is why I don't write documents like this, because I can't speak this lovely eloquently. The problem with all of this equity of access is that a fair number of the content that we grab out there for our users is limited. It's getting less so over time. I will give props to the device manufacturers and the vendors we do business with for making it better over the last few years, but it's still a problem. Not everything we have will work on everyone's devices. And part of that is the hardware and the hardware manufacturers. And part of that is the software, so the operating systems. So I don't know how many people have tried to teach a new iPad owner how to get an overdrive book onto their iPad for the first time, but the number of hoops that you have to jump through in order to make that happen is daunting. And if someone really is not super tech proficient, which many new iPad users are not, that creates an issue for us. And it can be done, but it can't be done easily. And we still have problems with a lot of our audiobook content being only accessible as Windows Media audio format, and that not working on many people's devices. And again, I think if we're talking about providing equitable access to people, that should mean regardless of what device they choose to purchase, regardless of what operating system they choose to use, we should be advocating to our vendors and the device manufacturers to make sure that as much of what we have is accessible to as many people as possible. The other problem with equity of access is the digital divide. So I'm sure some of you have seen the flurry of articles about the bookless library that's being proposed in Texas. And NPR interviewed me and quoted me, and for once I sounded like the curmudgeonly librarian, which is kind of hilarious. But what I was saying about that was I felt that, it's a premature move for a couple of reasons. One being, so much content isn't even available, so what is their selection really going to be like? But a big issue also is the digital divide. So I think that it's fine to have devices for people to check out. It's fine to have a nice, robust, well, as robust as you can make it, digital collection for people to access. I think it's great to have as many public computing devices in your library as possible. But to force people to a digital-only model in a community when the community isn't asking for it, and the community may or may not be appropriately trained up or technologically proficient or have the right kind of network access to be able to use that content digitally, I think is a mistake. And I think we have become so techno-lusty about moving to the digital, about jumping on board with what we see a lot of people preferring. And a lot of people do prefer to get stuff digitally. I do, certainly. But there's still a big portion of our population, and certainly more so in some communities than others, who either don't prefer digital, don't know how to access digital, don't have the capacity to access digital, either through their network or their hardware lack of access. And so it really concerns me that we have people kind of trying to force this on their communities. And that's something to keep in mind in the future, is at what point is your community ready for more digital stuff? What's your balance of budgetary and staff time dedication to a physical collection versus a digital collection, and does that match up with your community's needs and wants? And again, that will be different from community to community. I just spent a ton of time out on the very rural Northern California coast where there's nothing. I mean, there's like nothing, and there's a tiny town of 200 people, and another 40 miles of nothing. And there's no access out there. I mean, there's satellite internet for people who choose to pay for it, but that is it. That is your sole connection point. And so I'm thinking, okay, if one of these libraries moved to an all-digital model, or said, I'm sorry, we don't have print books anymore, we only have Nooks or Kindles, here, check these out instead. I'm kind of wondering how that would play over in those communities who simply don't have that kind of access. And so I think it's important to think about how your community may differ from all of the sexy, hot, trendy, topic-y stuff that we see in the popular media or even in the library media. Another principle is that we uphold the principles of intellectual freedom and resist all efforts to censor library resources. We talked about that a little bit earlier. But one of the biggest things to think about is net neutrality, which is an issue that keeps coming back in the U.S. Congress. And the principle of net neutrality is that information is information. All data is equal. All bits are created equal, as the slide says. And that no company or governmental body or individual should have the right to say this information is more important than that information. This company's traffic will move faster than that company's traffic. Or video is going to move faster than audio. For us, information is all equal. We don't pass judgment, and so we as librarians have and need to continue to be advocates to ensure that equity of information access in a digital age is continued. So I'm looking, and there's been a few questions that have come up. So Jamie's asking you all where you see libraries in 10 years as far as access to content, so I'd encourage as many of you to answer that as you can. Jessica says, I'm really uncomfortable purchasing access instead of content and expect that issue to be settled within 10 years. Local ebook content will be easier to discover, obtain, catalog, and distribute. I hope so. I agree. I think it will be settled in the next 10 years. I hope sooner rather than later. Whether we will arrive at a solution that's simply subscription licensing and access as opposed to content ownership, I'm not sure. I don't know which direction this is going to take. I can see it going one way or the other, and there are pros and cons to both, really. But I agree. I think in 10 years things will have settled down. I actually think in the next 2 to 3 years we'll see things settle down a lot more in terms of standardization of formats. And also the publishers starting to come around and talk more with us. I don't know if anyone saw the news story from, I think it was yesterday, the largest book publisher in the Netherlands has now removed all digital rights management from their titles, their ebook titles. And what we've seen over the years is with digital content, the trends start there. The trends start in Europe, particularly the Netherlands, Denmark, that area of the world, and then they kind of filter their way over here eventually. So I think that's a hopeful first step, something to think about. Colleen says it's hard to imagine considering how much digital content has changed in 10 years and how digital content rights are constantly in flux right now. It's very difficult to foresee. It's a topic that needs to continue being discussed. Absolutely. A lot of us that started talking about this like 8 or 9 years ago were so frustrated that nobody was listening because we knew this was going to be important and we knew we needed to make legal changes and challenges then, which we missed the boat on. But I'm so thrilled now that more people are talking about this and are concerned and are thinking about the future. And I would just encourage all of you to keep doing that, because the more we know and the more vocal we can be, the better questions we can ask and the better we can advocate for our communities. Karen says there are academic institutions where all of their textbooks are going to be e-textbooks, and the digital divide is a reality even in a city. Oh yeah, absolutely. Digital divide is not just limited to rural locations. I was trying to make the point of just network access, mobile access, for example. We're finding that academic textbook publishers, as well as for school libraries too, for schools, seem to be more willing to publish stuff digitally in a way that works for the school and for the libraries at the school, if the school is lucky enough to still have a library. And I think we're going to see more changes happen there more quickly than we'll see in public libraries. But again, that's maybe a place where we can look to see what the trends are going to be like with popular media and fiction in the future. And then Tamara says, I think we also need to make sure that we make every effort to preserve our print materials too, so we don't lose it permanently. And that's really interesting. I think that that's true for a lot of print stuff that's unique, stuff that is a work of art as opposed to a trade paperback, for example. There's a lot I know that we have that I can't imagine ever getting rid of because it is so unique and could not be reproduced, at least with today's technology, digitally in an adequate way. So I think preserving print in some format is important. And then I'm not sure, I'm not going to mention the names here, but we have 2 other questions. Are there clear guidelines anywhere for lending Kindles with content preloaded, or are we all on our own trying to figure it out? You cannot legally per Amazon's terms of service, lend a Kindle with content preloaded unless that content is completely public domain, period. If you lend Kindles with Kindle purchase content, Amazon purchase content, you're lending those out, you're breaking their terms of service, Amazon has come out already and told libraries, don't do that, and you're inviting a lawsuit. Now our city attorney has told me, that might be an interesting lawsuit to have. So we're talking about it, and that might be something that we're willing to take on, but you have to be willing and really realize you are inviting legal action from Amazon if you do that. Regarding what happened in the Netherlands, do we know who made this happen? My understanding from what I've read about the removal of DRM from that publisher is the publisher kind of saw the writing on the wall, the way things were going, wanted to get their content into the hands of more people reading their authors, and they felt that this was the best way to do that. The development of DRM is really expensive and adds a lot to the cost of production for digital content, so that may have, I'm guessing, been part of the reason as well. I think we'll hear more about this as time goes on, and I've got some emails out to friends in libraries in the Netherlands, and if I learn more, I will try to share that. All right. So as I said before, lots of laws coming up that really jump in the face of open access to information. We had SOPA, they all have lovely names, HIPAA, ACTA, CISPA, the Protect IP Act, Stop Cyber Martial Law, RAR. I think it's important for us to stay aware of this legislation, to make our communities aware of the legislation and its impact, and to keep that alive. All right, back to our ethics. We protect each library user's right to privacy and confidentiality with respect to information sought or received and resources consulted, borrowed, acquired, or transmitted. Right to privacy and confidentiality. This is a big bee in my bonnet. So for the first time in library history that I'm aware of, really, we started passing library user data to a large corporation through one of our third-party vendors. So library users log into the library website, they go to the Overdrive site, they say, oh, here's a book I like, I want it in Kindle format, and all of a sudden they get booted over to Amazon. Now, how much information Amazon is collecting on what our users are doing? We know they're tracking what they're checking out. We know they're tracking any notes or highlights or shares that they make from those books that they've checked out from the library. And most of our users don't know that. So that's kind of scary. And just so you know, you can put a pop-up warning in your Overdrive page as soon as someone chooses to check out a Kindle formatted book. Overdrive will do this for you on demand. That will say, hey, you're leaving the library's site, our privacy policies no longer apply. Amazon's do. You might want to ask them what they're doing with your data. I mean, it says it more legalese than that, but that's basically what it says. And we have that on our Overdrive site and got a lot of questions from users as a result, which was a good starting point for conversations about your personal data and just making informed choices. If people don't care that they're sharing what they're doing with Amazon, that's fine. That's their choice. But at least I'd like it to be an informed choice. And we have a question. Does Barnes & Noble have the same requirements for preloaded nooks as Amazon has for Kindles? No. So Barnes & Noble works very nicely with libraries. They will allow you to put the same title, buy it once, and put it on 6 different nooks and loan them out. They don't care. They like us. Barnes & Noble, I think, has found a real good niche market in libraries with their nooks as a result. So you can load nooks to your heart's content with content that you've gotten from Barnes & Noble or, again, any public domain content. But with Amazon and the Kindles, not so much, which is too bad. All right. We respect intellectual property rights. That's important because we do. And we advocate the balance between the interests of information users and rights holders. And again, going back to digital rights management, this is my favorite analogy for DRM. So I was in an absinthe bar in New Orleans at ALA, and I won't go into any more detail than that, but I needed to use a little girl's room. And this was the locking mechanism on the door. And it was this giant 3-foot-long rusty steel bar. And you had to, this was the signage for it, so slide lock. It was very, thank you. And you had to like manhandle this thing up and over and into a tiny little hook on the door. And it being, 2 o'clock in the morning and an absinthe bar, I was not in the best shape to be manhandling 3-foot-long pieces of metal. But I got it up, got it finally into the lock. and then realized that the door still opened about a foot and a half. So I was like, okay, well that's pointless. There's no privacy here. The lock didn't even work. And maybe it was because I had been talking to librarians seconds before, but it really just dawned on me, this is what digital rights management is. It's a pain in the butt to get it to work, to get it in place, to get through it so that it's supposedly how it's supposed to be, and it still doesn't even work because it's so easy to break. It's so easy to slip through it if you know anything about Google searching, about how to hack a Kindle or to strip DRM off of a piece of content and put it on wherever you want. If you know how to use a torrent site to download stuff that's already been ripped, it doesn't work. DRM simply does not work, and it's like this stupid bar at this absinthe bar. It doesn't work, and it's very frustrating whether you've had absinthe or not. So Cory Doctorow has been a longtime advocate for libraries, for open access to information, and advocates the Creative Commons model instead of really strict copyright. And one of the things that he says is Doctorow's first lie says, anytime someone puts a lock on something that belongs to you and won't give you a key, they're not doing it for your benefit. And this is a lesson I think ethically as librarians we need to take to heart. We are given a ton of stuff. We pay for it. We have a lot of content digitally that's locked down, and nobody's given us the key. They're saying, well, we'll kind of do a little pass-through lease access to the key for your users, but we're not going to give you the key. They're not doing that for us. They're not doing that for our users. They're doing that for them. And so we need to stand up, I think, and say no to digital rights management. Now, to me, this is why. It's anti-consumer. It's anti-library. It's been proven time and time again through study after study that it doesn't actually prevent piracy at all. It's discriminatory against people who are less tech savvy. It's like I said, if you have any tech savviness whatsoever, you can break through DRM like butter. It increases costs of production, which means it increases costs to us. It endangers preservation, as we talked about before. And really, all of these are good reasons why we should say no. So there's a nice little group, Librarians Against DRM, with a great logo. You can buy this on a hoodie, even on a thong if you really want to go for it. And a lot of us really believe firmly that this is the biggest challenge to libraries today is digital rights management for the future preservation and access to information. So that's all negative and bad, bad, bad. Okay, so what can we do? Well, we can say no to publishers that take advantage of us. And we can say no to content that has DRM on it. And we can definitely say no to vendors who bargain away these library values we've been talking about. And instead, we can say yes to vendors and to publishers who are willing to work with us. We can say yes to content that doesn't have DRM on it. We can say yes to cataloging Creative Commons licensed content, of which there is a ton in the world, much less in your own community. And saying yes to all of that wonderfully locally produced community content and getting that into the hands of your users. So one other thing from our code of ethics, it states we don't advance our private interests, the expense of library users, blah, blah, blah. And I just want to be very clear here. There are library vendors out there who do have a quid pro quo thing going quite often at conferences where they will say, if you sign up for this product today for your library, we'll give you an all-expense-paid 2-day trip to New York City or whatever. Now, I'm pretty sure that's going to be against whatever city, state, county, whatever policy you have with your employer, but it's also unethical for you to take private gains to get a contract or a product for your library. So please be very careful of that. If you see vendors doing it, report them to the conference organizers because what they're doing is against the very values that our profession holds dear. We also distinguish between our personal convictions and professional duties. That's a big one. We maintain and enhance our own knowledge and skills. And this has been hard because as things have changed so quickly, the tech changes so fast, the content changes so fast, it's been difficult to stay, up to date on all the things we're supposed to know. All of these devices out there, all the things that people are using. And that goal of maintaining our own knowledge and skills at an appropriate level is more of a challenge today than it ever has been. And I think it's important to A, acknowledge that, and B, to give our staff and our budgets the adequate time and resources to stay trained to an okay level without having to rely on people using their own time, their own money, their own devices, or by driving them nuts by just simply never providing them enough training and putting them in a position in a public service setting where they're going to feel stupid because they know less than the person they're trying to help. And none of us wants to do that to our staff. So let's go on to the last one, Ranganathan, my favorite. And a lot of what we've already talked about fits under his 5 laws. So books are for use. We want to make sure that all of this digital content is actually being used. How many of you look at stats? How many of you buy stuff based on holds versus based on a balanced collection? Make sure that your stuff is actually getting used and that you're investing money in a good way. Every reader has his or her, I added the or her book. Make sure that as many users in your community as possible know how to access this digital content. And if you do have the budget to be loaning out e-readers for people who can't afford them, I think that's a wonderful thing to do. Every book gets reader. So make sure that the books that you have are balanced, that you have as balanced a collection digitally as you can, given the limited content selection, and that you pay the same attention to careful selection there as you would for your physical collection. And that's something that we definitely as libraries didn't do in the early days of ebooks, but I'm seeing us do it more and more now, and that's very, very hopeful. Save the time of the reader. Well, that's hard to do when the whole process to get the books onto people's devices is complicated, cumbersome, and takes a fair amount of technology jiggery to get it to work. But our goal is to save the time of the reader, and we need to keep that goal in mind constantly. That's fuzzy. So this screenshot you've probably seen, it's been around for years. Why DRM doesn't work, or how to download an audiobook from the Cleveland Public Library. And it goes through all the steps you have to go through with Overdrive to get an audiobook onto your device, and the frustrations and all the places where someone could just give up. And I think that's one of those things where we were not saving the time of the reader when it worked like this. It works a little bit better now, but it's still way, way, way too many steps. And we need to advocate for smoother, better, more usable systems for all of these products. And then lastly, the library is a growing organism. The stuff is changing. This isn't stable. Literally every day there's something new to pay attention to in the world of digital content and its relationship to libraries, and we need to stay aware of all of that. Back in 2011, almost years ago now, Andy Woodworth and I wrote the eBook Users Bill of Rights. What we had at that point would be a good set of principles to adhere to, what we felt we believed in for ebook access for users. I would change a couple of things in this now, and that tells me things are moving so fast that just in the space of 2 years, what works or what I believe has actually shifted, and that's okay. But I think it is a good idea to continue to think about, in our ideal world, as librarians and library workers, as people who stand up for the freedom of information, what is our ideal scenario and how can we advocate for that? So some organizations to watch. So you've probably heard about what the Douglas County Libraries is doing. Khalifa here in California is now doing the same thing, collaborating with Smashwords to basically create, or 3M to create ebooks which get rid of the middleman. So the library is basically dealing directly with the publishers, hosting all the content themselves and owning the content, not just licensing it. The Digital Public Library of America. This organization has been doing some really good things, a lot of good talks and research. They're slightly too academically focused from my perspective as a public librarian. I'm having a hard time seeing how their work is really affecting my users' access right now, and I'm hopeful that will change in the future. But again, it's another organization to watch. And the Open Library Project done by the Internet Archive is incredibly important to take a look at. They have over 100 free ebook titles already available on their website. And if your library donates books to be scanned, basically all of your discards, we send them about 25 boxes a month. They will scan them, and then you have complete access not only to all of those scanned titles too, your users do, but all these scanned titles from all the other libraries who are donating books to be scanned. So this is definitely a site and an organization to watch too. And then Blue Jar. So this is a new way of thinking about how to publish digital content, how to publish ebooks out into the public without having digital rights management on it and still managing to get authors paid. So research it, take a look at it, put in a few bucks for a book that you really want to get out there, and then you get a copy of it. I think it's a really good model, and it's been pretty successful so far, so take a look. But in the end, it's the Wild West. I think it's okay to acknowledge that things are just moving super rapidly. It's okay to not understand all of it. It's okay to be unsure what the right decision is at any given point, because things are so different day to day. And what's most important is that all of us stay informed and that we continue having conversations and that we continue talking about these options with each other and once more advocating for our community's needs and interests. Because it all goes back to the warm, fuzzy love that we feel from the written word. It's wonderful to read a book and get that feeling, and we want to make sure that our users continue to be able to experience that through the library, whether it's a physical item or a digital item, and we don't want that lost to society forever. So here's my contact info, and I'm going to scroll back. I saw another couple of questions, but please feel free to throw more at me. Does the pop-up warning even really cover our ethics? Oh, back to the overdrive pop-up warning about Amazon Kindle books. I think it covers it in that we're saying, you know what, our privacy policies don't apply anymore. You want to go read Amazon's if you want to know what's being done with your data. I would love, personally, to have a pop-up warning that's like, you really don't want to do this. You really want to go get another e-reader that's not going to harvest all your personal data and sell it. But I don't think I can do that without getting in trouble with my city attorney. So I think the wording that we've arrived on is what will work best for us. It at least warns people that there's a choice being made that they should be aware of and where to go for more information. So I think that in that way it does deal with the ethical issue. Perhaps not as aggressively as I'd like, but I think it's certainly better than nothing. Okay, say a community is not very interested in going digital. Is the library still obligated to futurize as insurance against a future interest, or should the library not waste resources if there isn't a current interest, assuming the library is facing another budget cut? That's a great question. I don't think there's any obligation for a library to offer ebooks or other digital content today. You have no obligation to do that. I would say that it's good to let all of your users know about all of the free and open access digital content that's out there through projects like Open Library or Project Gutenberg, so that if they do like digital stuff, even if it's not stuff you're buying, they're aware that it's out there for them. But if your budget is super tight and your community, and you're confident in this, your community seriously does not have any significant interest in digital content, don't waste hundreds of thousands of dollars on something that's not going to get used. I think we would say that about anything. And I think it applies here too. All right, I feel an ethical conflict teaching and promoting the use of ebook readers. While I know that the vendor of the reader gets all the information about what the owner does with it and puts on it, it's a total opposite of library confidentiality values. How do we deal with or address that? Not to mention using Facebook and asking people to like us, blah, blah, blah. All right, so focusing on the ebook readers, when we teach classes in our library or we have help sessions on e-readers, we are very clear about the differences between the different e-readers, their platforms, the hardware, and the terms of service, which include confidentiality and privacy issues. So I think the more you can educate people about what the choices are, the better. It's hard, though, if people have already purchased a device and they're coming in with it. It's kind of hard to just say, oh, you just got to sell that and go get something else. You know, that's not useful. But making them aware of what is happening and any steps they can take to protect their data is a good idea. So, for example, I have 2 Kindles, and I've hacked the death out of both of them. My data is not being sent anywhere that I don't want it to be sent. I've been very careful about it. But what I did was broke the terms of service of Amazon in doing so, and invalidated my warranty and all that good stuff. And when I teach classes, I tell people, I can point you to a resource that will tell you how to do this, but I'm not going to show you how to do it because it violates terms of service, and legally as a city employee, I can't do that. But it's information that exists, and I will point you to it if you want it. So I think you do have that as a choice. As long as you're making people able to make their own decision based on information, that's our job. We can't make the decision for them. Another question. So ethically, we'd love to be like Douglas County, but in terms of resources, we don't have the time, money, et cetera, to support the platform or negotiations with the publishers. We are in the exact same position. But if we protest DRM licensing by not playing by the rules the vendors set, we don't have the ebook content our public wants, and we risk quickly becoming irrelevant. What do we do? All right, so this is the position I'm in right now. I'm part of a bigger consortium. A couple of us want to cease our contract with Overdrive because we don't like what they're doing. And we don't like any of the other vendor choices either because they have the same basic problems. So we're waiting to see how our project in California, Khalifa, which is modeled on Douglas County's, we're waiting to see how that works, hoping we can jump on board with that. That does still have DRM on it. It's lightweight DRM, but it does still have DRM. Personally, I'm willing to not have ebooks, paid ebooks, and to start putting energy into cataloging and providing better access to all of the free ebook content that is out there, because I would rather provide nothing than to provide an overpriced, limited selection of stuff that's locked down and that is not a good financial investment for my users with their limited tax dollars. Because every time I explain to people, oh, we had to pay $90 for that book that you only had to pay $10 for, they get extraordinarily pissed off. And rightly so. That's $90 that just got flushed down the toilet of their tax money. I think it's defensible to say, you know what, we are just not going to provide anything until we can provide stuff that we feel is a good fiscal investment. Now, I'm willing to take that risk. Whether I can convince enough other members of our consortium to take that risk, I don't know, but I am trying. And I think libraries that have the ability to just say no, and there are a number of libraries who don't have ebook content, paid ebook content at all, I think that that's okay. I think you can deal with the public outcry by having all of your talking points ready and the reasons why you're doing it. But it does mean that you have to be willing to deal with a fair amount of crap from people for a while. And I don't think you risk becoming irrelevant because libraries aren't just ebooks. Think about all the millions of things we do. I don't think it's necessarily imprudent to wait until the marketplace catches up with what we need the marketplace to be. I think that's okay. But again, community by community, director by director, that's going to be a different decision. All right. We're getting close on time, but here's one last question. Any thoughts on helping users combine library content with their own content and publishing it? Should we advise them to only work with public Creative Commons content? It depends on what they're remixing and how. So there are very, very pretty strict rules about how much of certain stuff you can use and take when you're remixing it. So being comfortable and familiar with copyright law is essential, and there's some good books out there written specifically for libraries and librarians about copyright law and use in libraries of the public of certain types of media and data. So you should get comfy with that. I tend to push people toward Creative Commons content, particularly, for example, if students are working on a project and need video clips or photographs. For research papers, obviously, as long as you're citing your stuff correctly, you're okay. I guess it just depends on what they're trying to remix. But typically with multimedia, I do push people more toward the Creative Commons end of things because it's easier, it's less risky, and it promotes a licensing model that works for the future, in my opinion. What do we do if there's no Khalifa in our area? Well, okay, so if you don't live in California or Douglas County, that will definitely be the case. That's pretty much everybody else. I think we want to wait and see how these models work. You know, neither of those organizations has really been able to draw in the big 6 publishers yet. And it remains to be seen if they'll be able to, or if it's necessary for them to do so, or if they can manage with what they do have access to, which is the bulk of published items. And it's, you know, it's a trial. And I think we really need to see how it works, what the pitfalls are, before we say, oh my gosh, this is the model. It might be, it might not be. But I think we do need to be careful about continuing to funnel lots of money into products that we know aren't necessarily working really well for us. And then I'm asked where I'm pointing people to hack their Kindles. Yeah, I'm not going to say that right now, but if people want to know, you can email me or get me on Twitter or Google Plus, and I'll talk to you.
That sounds like a good answer. Sarah, I have one last question for you that I'm asking all the presenters today, and that is, where do you see libraries 10 years from now? And that can mean in any aspect you want. It doesn't have to be digital content, but what do you see? Or what do you hope to see?
Oh, those are two different questions.
Yeah, they are.
I think that our funding will stabilize and maybe rise a tiny, tiny bit. I don't think we're going to see funding levels that we saw in the 80s or in the early 90s come back. I think that we are going to be stuck trying to provide the same or more services with less money and trying to figure out different ways to do that. And that does mean reducing services in certain areas and expanding them in others. I think we're going to continue to see the trend toward fewer open hours, and when the libraries are actually open, having less staff on the floor to be able to help people, which means longer lines and maybe less concierge level service, but that's the reality. I think in terms of digital content, in about 10 years, things will have settled down quite a bit, definitely with the printed word, so I think we'll see ebooks settle down a lot and have a sustainable model. As for music, I think we'll probably see that have settled down by then. With video content, though, TVs and movies, I can see that dragging on for another 20 years probably before that really gets settled in terms of what's going to be licensed to libraries. But yeah, I could be proven wrong, and I would be happy to be proven wrong, actually. But I do think we're going to see a continued change in the way that we use our spaces and the way that we use our staffing. And a lot of us have just kind of organically moved toward that already. And I just think we'll see a continued trend in that direction. But we'll still be around. We'll still be relevant. Our usage numbers will still continue to go up. It's just going to be a question of what we're being used for is going to change a little bit.
All right, thank you. And if I didn't get to your question, again, Sarah's info is on the screen. Feel free to email her. Sarah, thanks again. A lot of great content, a great presentation. Thank you all for listening in. We have our final webinar coming up at 4 o'clock with Joan Fry-Williams. If you haven't registered, you still can. If you are registered, we will talk to you then. Thanks, everybody.